A United States Army Signal Corps photograph dated June 25, 1945 carries the caption, 713th Tank Battalion in action on Coral Ridge. The image was taken in southern Okinawa during the final mop-up of the campaign. It shows a Sherman medium tank from the 713th, equipped with a flamethrower in place of the bow machine gun, firing into the entrance of a cave. The flame jet is reaching out across roughly 40 yards of open ground. The fuel is thickened gasoline, sprayed under 300 pounds per square inch of pressure, and it does not burn the way ordinary fire burns. It pours. It clings to whatever it touches. It consumes oxygen at a rate that empties a closed chamber in seconds. The men inside that cave had been ordered by the commanding general of the 32nd Army, Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, to fight to the death. The photograph does not record what happened next. The unit log of the 713th records what was happening up and down the southern part of the island that week. Japanese soldiers, in numbers that surprised the American officers receiving the surrenders, were coming out of the caves with their hands up. Some had refused food and water for days rather than fight on. Others were the conscripted labourers and home guard troops the Imperial Army had pressed into service in the final months. The thing they had in common was that they had decided not to wait for the flame. This is a small piece of a larger story about how an American weapon system, built by enlisted Navy construction workers in a workshop in Hawaii, broke the most sophisticated cave defense doctrine the 20th century would produce. To understand what that meant on the ground, you have to go back to a moment when the senior officers of the Imperial Japanese Army, in private, accepted that they were no longer fighting to win the war and decided what they were going to fight for instead. By the late summer of 1944, the men running the Japanese war effort had stopped believing that victory was possible. The combined fleet had been gutted at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June, where Japanese carrier aviation had been destroyed in a one-sided air engagement that American pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Saipan had fallen in July. The B-29 bomber, flying from the captured Marianas, was now within range of the Japanese home islands, and the firebombing campaign that would burn out the wooden cores of Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya was only months away. Civilian production had been gutted by the submarine blockade, which had cut off the flow of raw materials from the conquered territories of Southeast Asia. Tanker losses had reached a point where the Imperial Navy was running out of fuel for what remained of its surface fleet. There was no operational reserve left worth the name. What the High Command in Tokyo could still hope to do was raise the price of victory until the Americans declined to pay it. They believed, with some reason, that the United States would not bear unlimited casualties for unconditional surrender. If a few Japanese garrisons could exact heavy enough losses on small enough islands, perhaps the Americans would offer terms. That belief, more than any technical innovation, was the engine behind what came next. In August of 1944, the Imperial General Headquarters issued a directive that broke with a generation of Japanese tactical training. The directive ordered Pacific commanders to stop trying to defeat American landings at the water's edge. Beach defense, the new doctrine argued, was futile against the weight of modern naval gunfire. Garrisons were instead to withdraw inland, dig into the high ground, and turn the interior of every island into an underground fortress. The doctrine had a name, Fukaku, sometimes translated as honeycomb defense, sometimes as defense in depth from prepared subterranean positions. Its purpose was not to hold ground but to bleed the attacker. Let the Americans land. Let them walk inland. Kill them, after that, in a slow daily count, from positions they could not see and could not effectively reach. The man who would push this doctrine to its most thorough application was a 52-year-old career officer named Tadamichi Kuribayashi, born in Nagano Prefecture and educated in part in the United States. As a young attaché in the late 1920s, he had ridden cavalry at Fort Bliss in Texas and studied at Harvard. He understood the country he was about to fight, including its industrial capacity and its political appetite for casualties. In late May of 1944, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo summoned him to Tokyo and informed him that he had been chosen to defend a small volcanic island roughly 750 miles south of the capital. Written orders followed on June 8. The island was Iwo Jima. Kuribayashi flew out and arrived on June 19. He told his wife in a letter that he did not expect to return. For the next 8 months, working with mining engineers shipped in from Japan, Kuribayashi turned that island, only 5 miles long from end to end, into one of the most heavily fortified pieces of ground in the world. By the time the Marines landed in February of 1945, 11 miles of tunnels ran beneath the surface. 25% of the garrison had been detailed to digging. The volcanic stone was soft enough to cut with hand tools. Underground chambers ranged in size from positions for 3 or 4 men to communal rooms that could hold 300 or 400. There were stairways, ventilation shafts, aid stations, command posts, and ammunition dumps. Mount Suribachi alone contained more than 1,000 fortified positions. Every square yard of the island was covered by interlocking fire from at least 2 concealed firing points. There was no front line on Iwo Jima in any meaningful sense, just a darkness with fire ports cut into it, and the Marines had to walk into it. The American military had been building toward the cave problem for almost 2 years before Iwo Jima. The first hard warning had come in November of 1943 on a coral atoll in the Gilbert Islands called Tarawa. The 2nd Marine Division landed on the small main island of Betio, expecting a difficult day, and ran into 76 hours of slaughter. The tide fell wrong against the offshore reef. Landing craft hung up in shallow water hundreds of yards from the beach. Marines waded in chest deep under interlocking machine gun fire from concrete pillboxes. The preliminary bombardment had not damaged. Of the men in the first 3 assault waves, more than half became casualties before they reached the seawall. By the time Betio was secure on November 23, 1,009 American Marines and sailors had been killed, and 2,101 wounded in 3 days. The Japanese garrison of 4,500 men was annihilated. Only 17 Japanese soldiers were taken alive. Tarawa told the United States military something that, until then, had been theoretical. Conventional infantry tools, the rifle, the grenade, the satchel charge, were not enough against an enemy who would not surrender and who fought from concrete. The Marines at Tarawa had brought 60 portable backpack flamethrowers ashore, weapons issued by the Army Chemical Warfare Service, and they had killed Japanese defenders in pillboxes that nothing else could reach. But the man carrying the flamethrower was, in any practical sense, expendable. He weighed 70 pounds more than the man next to him because of the fuel tanks on his back. He moved slowly. He had to close to within 30 or 40 yards of his target. Japanese riflemen learned almost immediately to identify him and shoot him first. By later in the war, on Iwo Jima, one Marine portable flamethrower unit suffered casualties of more than 90%. There had to be another way to deliver the same weapon. The man who concluded that the answer was a tank, with a flamethrower in place of its main gun, was a colonel in the Army Chemical Warfare Service named George Unmacht. Unmacht commanded a small section in the Central Pacific Area headquarters in Hawaii, and the problem of cave warfare had been pushed onto his desk because nobody in the larger procurement system thought it was important enough to handle through normal channels. In early 1944, Unmacht began assembling what amounted to an unofficial workshop at Schofield Barracks on Oahu. He had a few Army Chemical Warfare Service technicians from the 43rd Chemical Laboratory Company. Through a working relationship with the Navy, his group also drew on enlisted men of the 117th Naval Construction Battalion, the Seabees. A handful of Marine and Army officers were attached as liaisons, and the workshop had 24 obsolete M3 light tanks made available by the Ordnance Department because nobody in the frontline tank battalions wanted them anymore. The first conversion was crude in the extreme. Unmacht's group removed the M3's 37mm gun and mounted, in its place, a Canadian-made Ronson flamethrower, fed from a 170-gallon fuel tank installed inside the hull. The first vehicle off the line, built by the 43rd Chemical Laboratory Company, was christened Hell's Afire. It and its sisters were demonstrated on April 15, 1944, in front of officers from the Army, the Navy, and the Marine Corps, and unanimously adopted for combat use. The Marine Corps gave the new vehicle the name Satan. 24 Satans went to war with the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions for the assault on Saipan in June of 1944. They had problems from the moment the ramps came down. The turret could only traverse 180 degrees, because the fuel piping ran through the hull and prevented full rotation. Radio interference from the ignition system made coordination with infantry difficult. The flame projector had a maximum range of only 60 to 80 yards on a good day, and considerably less in a wind. The fuel ran out in roughly 2 minutes of sustained firing, after which the tank had to withdraw to a refueling point in the rear before it could engage again. The crew was reduced to 2 men in a turret built for 3, with the loader's position taken up by the fuel system. The Satans were typically deployed in groups of 4, with one M5A1 Stuart light tank for gunnery cover, since the Satans themselves had no main gun and could not reply to anti-tank fire. But against the Japanese defenders dug into the cliffs at Marpi Point at the northern end of Saipan, the Satan proved something the rifle and the satchel charge had not been able to prove. A Japanese soldier in a cave, who had been promised that no American weapon could reach him in his rock, could be reached. Fire could be poured into the cave entrance. Oxygen could be consumed. Men could be made to come out. The Satans crossed over to the smaller island of Tinian on July 24 for the next operation, where the more open terrain made the weapon even more effective than it had been on Saipan. The Tinian campaign was completed in 9 days. By the end of the Marianas operations, every senior officer who had been asked to write an evaluation of the Satan had agreed on 2 things. The first was that the weapon had saved American lives. The second was that the platform was wrong. The light tank simply could not carry enough fuel, and its armor was too thin to operate close enough to the cave entrances to be reliably effective. 4 Seabees who had worked on the Satan project received Navy and Marine Corps commendations from Lieutenant General Holland Smith, the Marine Corps commander of the Fleet Marine Force in the Pacific. At least 7 received the Bronze Star. Saipan was secured on July 9, 1944. By then, Unmacht had concluded that the right platform was the M4 Sherman, the medium tank that was already the workhorse of every American armored unit in the Pacific. On August 17, 1944, just as the 10th Army was being assembled under Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. for the eventual invasion of Okinawa, Unmacht held a second demonstration in Hawaii for senior officers of all 3 services. This time the prototype was a Sherman with a flamethrower replacing the 75mm main gun. The decision was immediate. Mount the new weapon in M4 Shermans, with the largest fuel capacity that operating efficiency would allow, and deliver 54 of them to the 10th Army for Okinawa. Within weeks, the first 2 experimental Sherman conversions came off the line at Schofield Barracks. They were named Hell's Afire and Confused Buster. The names carried over from the lighter Satan project, but these were different vehicles, on a different chassis, designed by a different team. Both prototypes were tested, modified, and refined in a process that the official record describes as almost daily improvements. 2 enlisted Seabees, Machinist's Mate First Class A. Reich and Electrician's Mate Second Class Joseph Kissel were credited with the design that would become the production model, designated POA Chemical Warfare Service, H1. Neither man held a college degree. Neither was an officer. Reich and Kissel had simply been given a problem and the time to solve it, and they had solved it. The H1 was, on the outside, an ordinary Sherman. It kept the tank's outward appearance, which mattered because Japanese suicide squads tended to single out anything that looked unusual. It kept its full turret rotation. The flame projector ran at 300 pounds per square inch and could throw thickened napalm fuel out to 400 feet. Conversion required 150 pounds of welding rod and 1,100 individual electrical connections. Each tank cost between $20,000 and $25,000 to convert, a small figure by the standards of late-war American military spending. The Fleet Marine Force had asked for these tanks for the upcoming Iwo Jima operation. On November 15, 1944, the Pacific Ocean Area's Commander-in-Chief approved the urgent order. 8 tanks were to be delivered by November 30. Unmacht's group delivered them on November 30 exactly, and the 8 Shermans went aboard transports for the Marines of the 4th Tank Battalion. The men who saw what those 8 tanks did at Iwo Jima would never quite agree on the right way to describe it. The official Marine Corps after-action language was restrained. The 4th Tank Battalion wrote that the flamethrower was probably the most valuable single weapon employed at Iwo Jima. The 23rd Regimental Combat Team called the new tank highly successful and recommended that more large flamethrower tanks be provided. The 5th Tank Battalion called it an extremely effective piece of equipment. Captain Frank Caldwell, a company commander with the 26th Marines, was less restrained. In his view, he wrote afterward, it was the flame tank, more than any other supporting arm, that won the battle. The flame tanks did not fight alone. They could not. Without infantry support, they were vulnerable to the suicide squads the Japanese called nikudan, or human bullets, men ordered to charge a tank with a satchel charge or a magnetic mine in the hope of stopping it long enough for their position to survive another hour. The Japanese counter to the flame tank was to drive off its supporting infantry first, with mortars and small arms fire from concealed positions, and then to rush the now blind tank with these men. To answer this, Marine tank crews welded extra concrete armor up to 4 inches thick onto the hulls of some of their flame tanks. They mounted a .50 caliber machine gun coaxially with the flamethrower on at least one 4th Division vehicle. They worked with riflemen at almost touching distance, the tank advancing, the infantry sweeping the flanks, the tank advancing again. By the closing days of the battle, Marines from the 5th Division were burning between 5,000 and 10,000 gallons of thickened fuel per day. The tanks had become so essential that infantry commanders held up their attacks until a flame tank was available to support them. There were only 4 flame tanks per battalion, so they were pooled and dispatched by radio whenever a stubborn cave or pillbox refused to fall. Joseph Kissel, the enlisted CB designer, went ashore at Iwo Jima in February of 1945 as a maintenance specialist. In practice, he served 20 days as an assistant driver and gunner with the tank crews he had built. Kissel later received a Bronze Star. The cave fighting on Iwo Jima developed a grammar of its own. A typical engagement against a fortified cave or blockhouse moved through stages that the Marine tank crews learned to repeat without speaking. Conventional Sherman tanks would advance with the supporting infantry to a position from which the cave entrance was visible. They would mark the position with their main gun, suppressing any obvious supporting fire from adjacent caves. When the position had been isolated, the flame tank, called forward by radio, would approach to within 40 to 60 yards. It would fire a short-ranging burst to confirm the line of fire. Then it would deliver a sustained burn into the cave mouth, lasting anywhere from 10 seconds to a full minute, depending on how much fuel the tank still had and how deep the chamber appeared to be. The thickened fuel did not need to reach every defender directly. Ignited inside an enclosed space, it consumed all available oxygen within seconds. Defenders who were not killed by the fire itself were suffocated by what the fire took out of the air. After the burn, infantry and engineers would close in on the entrance. Some caves had connecting tunnels, and the survivors would withdraw through them. Many caves did not. Where survivors emerged, they were often disoriented, partly burned, and willing to surrender, although surrender on Iwo Jima remained the exception until the very end of organized resistance. The Marines also learned that a cave that had been flamed and then sealed with explosive charges sometimes had to be reopened later because Japanese troops in deeper galleries had survived and worked their way back to surface positions overnight. The flame tanks were sometimes called back to the same map coordinates 2 or 3 times in the same week. Marine combat engineers eventually adopted the practice of pumping bulldozer fuel directly into a cave system before sealing the entrances, a procedure that had not been part of any pre-war manual, but that became standard procedure in the second half of the campaign. Iwo Jima was declared secure on March 26, 1945. The Marines had taken almost 27,000 casualties to capture an island 5 miles long. The Japanese garrison of more than 20,000 men had been almost entirely killed. Kuribayashi himself died on or around March 23, although the precise circumstances of his death have never been confirmed. The cave defense had not held. It had killed Americans at a rate that horrified the home front, but it had failed to stop the Marines from taking the island. And the after-action reports flowing back to Washington and to Hawaii were unanimous on what had made the difference at the unit level: the flame tank. If you have a grandfather, a great-uncle, or a family friend who served in the Pacific, in any branch, on any island, the comments below are the right place for his name and his unit. Most of these men did not write memoirs. Most of them did not give recorded interviews. The names get lost a generation at a time, and the comments section is one of the few places left where they can still surface. Why was the flame tank not a standard piece of equipment in every Allied army on Earth? The flamethrower itself was not new. It had been used in trench warfare in the First World War. The Soviets had fielded flamethrower tanks earlier in the Second. The British Churchill Crocodile had performed brilliantly during the Normandy campaign in mid-1944. The Canadian-designed Ronson unit at the heart of the early American flame tanks had been an export product. The technology was not American property. What was American, and what made the Pacific flame tank possible, was a particular kind of administrative looseness. Unmacht's flame tank group at Schofield Barracks was not a chartered unit through any normal channel. It existed because Unmacht had decided it should exist. The men working in it were a composite of Army Chemical Warfare Service technicians, enlisted Navy Seabees, and Marine Corps liaison officers, drawn together across service boundaries that other militaries would have treated as walls. The official work week was 60 hours. The men, on their own initiative, worked 75. They scrounged steel from damaged Sherman hulls returning from the front. They got 1.5-inch fire hose from the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard without paperwork. They took 5 Navy Mark I flamethrowers that the Navy had declared unsuitable and folded them into the design. By June of 1945, the program had grown enough that the United States Army cancelled all further M4 Sherman production, and Under-Secretary of War Robert Patterson placed the flame tank conversion program on AAA procurement priority, the same priority assigned to the B-29 bomber and the Manhattan Project. The Marine Corps placed an order for 72 more flame tanks for the planned invasion of Japan. Unmacht's crews had 70 ready by victory over Japan Day. Across the entire program, the flame tank group produced 354 converted tanks and trained 750 Army, Navy, and Marine Corps personnel as operators or instructors. In November of 1944, the 10th Army made a decision that had no precedent in American military history. The 713th Tank Battalion, then on outpost duty in the Hawaiian Islands and equipped with M4 Sherman mediums in standard configuration, was to be converted in its entirety into a flame tank battalion. The order arrived on November 10, addressed to the battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas McCrary of Arlington, Virginia. McCrary was given less than 4 months to take all 54 of his Shermans down to their hulls, refit them with the POA Chemical Warfare Service H-1 flamethrower system, retrain his entire crew complement on the new weapon, develop tactics for its employment, and embark for Okinawa. The conversion eliminated the battalion's internal company of M5 Stuart light tanks and its mortar platoon. The remaining men retrained from the gunnery they knew on a weapons system that did not yet have a doctrine. The 713th provided 60 additional men of its own to assist the Seabees in the conversion work, a labor exchange that had the side effect of teaching the battalion's mechanics how to maintain the flamethrower systems they would soon be operating in combat. They made the deadline. The 54th and final flame tank was completed on January 25, 1945, 3 days before the battalion was officially assigned to Operation Iceberg, the code name for the invasion of Okinawa. 10 landing ships and 1 attack transport, the Menard, departed Pearl Harbor on March 4. Aboard were 726 officers and enlisted men, the battalion's tanks, supply vehicles, and accumulated stocks of thickened napalm fuel. The convoy steamed west through stopovers at Eniwetok and Saipan. On April 2, the 713th arrived off Okinawa. The main amphibious assault, L-Day, had gone in across the Hagushi beaches the day before, on April 1st. The battalion came ashore on April 7, 6 days behind the lead divisions, with no enemy resistance because the Japanese, following their doctrine, had not contested the beaches. 1 Sherman from C Company drove into a hole on the offshore reef and was lost. The battalion went into combat with 53 flame tanks. The man who had organized the defense of the southern third of Okinawa was the commanding general of the 32nd Army, Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima. Ushijima was 57 years old, a former commandant of the Imperial Japanese Army Academy, an officer with a reputation in the Japanese Army for personal humanity that was unusual at his rank. Junior officers under his command were discouraged from striking enlisted men, a routine practice elsewhere in the service. Ushijima relied heavily on his staff and treated his subordinates with patience. The force he had been given amounted to 120,000 men, dug into a 60-mile-long island of rolling hills, limestone ridges, and ancient Ryukyuan tombs. Before the invasion, Ushijima had moved his fortifications inland into the southern hill country and had evacuated 80,000 civilians off the island before the attack came. The defenses he built were the most extensive cave defense network the Imperial Japanese Army would ever construct. Where Iwo Jima had been a test of the doctrine, Okinawa was the full examination. The first 3 weeks of the campaign were almost eerily quiet for the Americans. Then, in mid-April, the 10th Army pushed south into the Shuri Line, and the cave doctrine reasserted itself. American infantry attacks on positions like Sugarloaf Hill, Half Moon Hill, and the Awacha Pocket were running into casualty rates that, for a single day's fighting, sometimes matched the per-day losses at Tarawa. The 713th got its first combat in this period, and it began with what came to be called the Death Ride of the Shermans. On April 19, 1945, Company B of the 713th was attached to the 193rd Tank Battalion for an attempt to bypass Kakazu Ridge, the strongest position on the Shuri outer line. The plan called for the tanks to reach the village of Kakazu behind the ridge and link up with the infantry. The infantry was stopped by Japanese fire on the ridge crest before it could move. The tanks pressed forward without them. 22 American tanks were destroyed or abandoned, the largest single battle loss of armor in the entire Pacific War. 17 of those vehicles were eventually salvaged and returned to action, but the lesson was unmistakable. Tanks, operating without close infantry support, in country prepared by Japanese engineers, were not survivable. From Kakazu onward, the 713th would never be deployed except as part of an integrated combined arms team. The standard procedure on Okinawa was a kind of grim choreography. A platoon of conventional Sherman tanks would advance with infantry support to a position from which the cave or pillbox to be reduced was visible. Once the conventional tanks had identified the target and suppressed any obvious supporting fire, a flame tank would be called forward by radio. The flame tank would advance to a range of typically 40 to 60 yards from the cave entrance, take aim, and pour thickened napalm into the chamber for the duration the tactical situation allowed. Where a cave was physically inaccessible to the tank itself, an innovation developed on Okinawa came into play. 50-foot lengths of Navy fire hose were coupled together into a 400-foot extension, fed from the tank's fuel tank, and carried forward by a 2-man infantry team carrying a portable M22 flamethrower nozzle on the far end. The tank could remain 2 football fields back in cover, while infantrymen with the hose reached caves around corners, on reverse slopes, and over ridge crests where direct fire was impossible. Unmacht recorded one specific incident, told to him by the commanding general of the 7th Infantry Division, in which a captain and a sergeant of that division, working under covering fire from a flame tank platoon, hauled the hose extension up onto the top of the Yeju Dake escarpment and used it to clear several hundred Japanese troops from a series of cave positions on the reverse slope. The most concentrated 5 days of flame tank action in the entire campaign came in mid-June, in the fight for the Yuza Dake and Yeju Dake escarpment in the southern part of the island. From June 13 through June 17, the 713th's flame tanks directed more than 37,000 gallons of burning fuel into the cave systems and rock outcroppings of the 2 peaks. Yuza Peak fell on June 16. By the evening of June 17, the 10th Army held the entire crest line. Ushijima's army, backed against the southern coast and out of room to retreat further, began to disintegrate. The June 25 photograph that opens this account dates from the mop-up phase that followed, when the 713th was still working through caves the main combat had bypassed. Ushijima himself committed ritual suicide on June 22, in a cave headquarters on Hill 89 at the southern tip of the island. He had refused, 2 weeks earlier, a personal letter from General Buckner asking him to surrender. His chief of staff, Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, had asked permission to die with him. Ushijima had refused. "If you die," he told Yahara, "there will be no one left who knows the truth about the Battle of Okinawa." Yahara was captured a week later, the most senior Japanese officer to survive the campaign, and he later wrote the book that contains the most detailed Japanese account we have of how the 32nd Army actually fought. Buckner himself did not live to see the campaign end. He was killed by Japanese artillery fire on June 18, 4 days before Ushijima's suicide. The 713th was in continuous action from April 7 to June 30, a span of 85 days. The battalion's after-action statistics, when they were tabulated, were striking. The 713th credited itself with 4,788 Japanese killed and 49 taken prisoner. The battalion's own losses, killed or missing in action, totaled 8 men. 111 were wounded. The kill ratio, as the battalion calculated it, ran at roughly 40-1. Across the campaign, the 713th burned through 200,000 gallons of thickened napalm. These were the battalion's own claimed figures. Japanese casualty counts on Okinawa were generally inflated by the units doing the counting, in this campaign as in others. But even when discounted, the disproportion between what the flame tank could do and what it cost to operate was unlike anything in any other American armored unit's record from any theater of the war. There is a question that flows from this record, and it is not a comfortable one. The flame tank was a humane weapon, in a narrow and specific sense, only because it ended battles faster than the alternative. The alternative, in cave warfare, was a campaign measured in months and in tens of thousands of American casualties, in which infantry would have to clear every chamber by hand, often at the cost of a man for a defender. The flame tank shortened the battle. It made some Japanese defenders surrender who would otherwise have died. It saved very large numbers of American lives, a judgment shared by the Marine Corps after action assessments at Iwo Jima, the Army assessments at Okinawa, and the post-war evaluations of the Chemical Warfare Service. It is also true that the weapon killed by burning and by suffocation, that it killed defenders who could not see what was coming, and that it killed Okinawan civilians who had been pressed into the caves alongside Japanese soldiers and had no way out. The men who designed and crewed and rode in those tanks knew this. The recollections of 713th veterans, recorded in the years and decades after the war, are notable for their absence of triumphalism. They speak of having been given a job and of having been relieved that the war ended before they had to invade the Japanese home islands, where a flame tank operation on the scale of Okinawa was being planned with 72 more conversions on order. Why did the cave defense, which had worked devastatingly at Tarawa, on Saipan, on Peleliu, and through much of Iwo Jima, suddenly hit its limit on Okinawa? The numerical answer is that the 10th Army on Okinawa fielded more than 60 mechanized flamethrowers between the 713th and the smaller flame elements attached to the Marine tank battalions, and the Japanese had nothing comparable. The tactical answer is that the American doctrine for cave warfare had matured into a coordinated combined arms procedure that integrated infantry, conventional armor, flame armor, artillery, and naval gunfire in a way that simply had not existed at Tarawa 18 months earlier. The deeper answer is doctrinal. Fukaku had been built around an assumption that the cave was a sanctuary that could not be reduced, only contained. The doctrine assumed that an American attacker, denied the option of clearing a cave by direct fire, would either bypass the position or accept the slow casualties of grenade and satchel charge clearance. The flame tank attacked that assumption at its foundation. It made the cave reducible. Once the cave was reducible, the entire arithmetic of the Japanese strategy began to come apart. Some of the surviving evidence on this point comes from the Japanese side. After the surrender in August of 1945, American intelligence officers began the long process of interviewing senior Japanese officers, first under formal interrogation and later in the more open settings that produced the records of the United States Strategic Bombing Survey and the post-war Far East Command intelligence files. Yahara's later memoir, written from his own perspective as Ushijima's chief of staff at Okinawa, makes the same point in different words. Cave defenders could no longer be relied on to remain in their caves once they understood that the steel box outside could reach them. The defensive position was no longer a fortress, it was a trap. Yahara records that toward the end of the campaign, he and Ushijima both watched the casualty figures coming back from the frontline units and recognized that the underground positions were no longer functioning as the doctrine had assumed they would. Soldiers were dying inside caves before they had inflicted the casualties they were meant to inflict. Conscripted Okinawan Home Guard troops were surrendering in numbers that the Japanese command had not anticipated. Some regular army units were holding, but even the regulars were being burned out faster than they could move through the connecting tunnels. After the campaign, the Marine Corps and the Army both prepared formal recommendations for how the flame tank should be employed in future operations. General Roy Geiger, commanding the 3rd Amphibious Corps, recommended that a company of flame tanks be made organic to each Marine tank battalion. General John Hodge, commanding the 24th Corps, asked for the attachment of 2 full flame tank battalions for any future amphibious operation. The official 10th Army assessment described the gun-tube flamethrower of the 713th as an all-around better weapon and the most practicable of the 3 flamethrower types used in the campaign. The Marines who had fought alongside the 713th simply called for more of them. Nobody who had used the weapon in combat wanted to fight the next island without it. The names of the men who built the weapon that did this are not in the standard textbooks. Colonel George Unmacht of the Chemical Warfare Service, who organized and ran the flame tank group, finished the war as one of the senior figures in his branch, and is barely remembered outside specialist literature. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas McCrary, who took the 713th through its conversion in less than 4 months and commanded it through 85 days of combat on Okinawa, is similarly obscure. Machinist's mate First Class A. Reich and electrician's mate Second Class Joseph Kissel, the 2 enlisted Seabees credited with the design that became the production flame tank of the war, appear in the historical record only in passing references. Captain Frank Caldwell of the 26th Marines, whose remark on the flame tank winning the Battle of Iwo Jima has been quoted in unit histories but rarely beyond them, is not a household name. The men who crewed the tanks themselves are, in the main, anonymous. Their actions sit in unit logs and after-action reports and the occasional personal interview conducted decades later. Most of them came home, took ordinary jobs, raised children, and did not speak of what they had done. The flame tank did not end the Pacific War. The atomic bombs did not end it by themselves either. What ended it was the slow accumulation of pressures, the bombing campaigns and the submarine blockade, and the collapse of Japanese industrial capacity, and the entry of the Soviet Union into the conflict in the final week. The flame tank was one piece of a larger mechanism, but it was the piece that broke a particular Japanese theory of how to make the Americans pay for their victory. The theory had been built on a single bet. It assumed that an attritional defense, conducted from caves and tunnels by men who would not surrender, could inflict casualties at a rate that would eventually break American political will to continue the war. It was not an irrational bet. The casualties at Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima had been shocking. American newspapers had carried photographs of the dead on the beaches that genuinely disturbed the home front. The flame tank did not by itself break the bet, but it changed the rate. It made a Japanese cave reducible at a price the American military could afford. On Okinawa, that change made possible a kill ratio against a Japanese garrison that was supposed to be uncapturable, except at unbearable cost. The arithmetic of an invasion of the home islands shifted, not all the way, but enough. What broke the cave defense, in the end, was not American bravery alone, although the American infantry on those islands were as brave as any soldiers anywhere. The components of the flame tank were not technologically advanced. The thickened fuel chemistry, the pressurized projector, the Sherman chassis itself were all decade-old technologies in 1945. The flame tank group's 354 vehicles were not produced at industrial scale by any reasonable measure. What did break the cave defense was a small group of working men in a workshop on Oahu, given a problem and the latitude to solve it, who built, between them, a weapon the formal procurement system would never have produced on its own. The Japanese doctrine, for all its sophistication, had been designed against the wrong enemy. It assumed an attacker who would have to come into the cave to win. The Americans found a way to win without coming in. There is a footnote in the post-war history of the Chemical Warfare Service in the Pacific that I have come back to more than once. Across 2 years of construction, 354 flame tanks built in the Schofield Barracks workshop, The official record lists exactly one accident. A man cutting armor plate was burned by acetylene gas and was hospitalized for 16 days. The men in that workshop had been very, very careful. They knew that the men in the tanks they were building would have to be careful too. And on a coral ridge in southern Okinawa on June 25, 1945, the careful work of those men in Hawaii had reached the mouth of a cave, and the Japanese soldiers inside had decided not to wait. The flame tanks themselves had a brief afterlife. The 713th was deactivated after the war, and the Army kept no flame tanks on its rolls. The Marine Corps preserved a small number of the Pacific-built Shermans at storage facilities at Camp Pendleton in California and at Pearl Harbor. When the Korean War broke out in June of 1950, those preserved Marine flame tanks were the only mechanized flame capability the United States had available. 9 of them were assembled into a single platoon, attached to the headquarters of the 1st Tank Battalion, and given the unit name Flame Dragons. They landed in the second wave at Incheon on September 15, 1950, and went on to fight at the First Battle of Seoul. They were the only American flame tank unit to see combat in Korea. By the time the Korean War ended, the Sherman-based flame tanks were obsolete. They were replaced in 1955 by a new design mounted on the M67 medium tank chassis, and the workshop on Oahu, by then long disbanded, became a footnote in the official histories. But the men who had built those Shermans had handed forward a piece of equipment that fought in 2 wars, and that saved an unknown number of American lives in both of them. If this account changed anything in how you think about that part of the war, leave a thought below. If you want more stories from the Pacific that are not in the standard textbooks, the kind of small, specific, mostly forgotten stories that make up the actual texture of what happened, subscribe and stay with the channel. The men who fought this war were not symbols. They had names and trades and hometowns. Most of them never thought of themselves as heroes at all. They thought of themselves as ordinary men who had been asked to do an extraordinary job and who had done it because someone had to, and because the someone in that moment was them.